Greetings, everyone. I'd like to get started. I'm Kevin McPeak from Symantec, and I'm greatly appreciative of CIO Council for hosting this event and for inviting me to present on defense in depth, data loss prevention strategies to thwart the insider threat. And before I begin, it's pretty much obligatory at any of these types of conferences, if you're the speaker, immediately after lunch to have a sort of a clever joke about a carbohydrate coma and things of that nature. So please take that comment as my perfunctory humor for that. Again, thank you. So our adversary in the federal space, as well as across corporate America and even the American public, is well-versed in military strategy, military science, and much of it even predating the discovery of America. So here you can see, I won't read it to you, but you see the quote from the famous Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu. There's also another well-known quote from Karl von Clausewitz, which is, "The backbone of surprise is fusing speed with secrecy." And when we live in a digital age, the ability for an adversary to move very quickly to conduct exfiltration of sensitive government data is amazing. It literally can be at the speed of light if we're operating on fiber networks. For me, the whole idea of insider threat is actually very personal. In addition to working full-time for Symantec, I'm also an Army reservist, and I was mobilized to go to Baghdad 2010, 2011. I was actually there for a good part of our drawdown. And what I noticed was when we were transitioning, and again, this is anecdotal, I don't have any hard facts to back this up, but just my personal observation, some other soldiers that I spoke with. So when we first got there, the Army has what's called direct fire and indirect fire, so DF and IDF. So the IDF, the indirect fire, was pretty random over the fence line. They couldn't see us, and just artillery shells or rifle rounds would come over, not doing a lot of damage. But as we were transitioning to have less and less personnel in the base, inviting more and more of the local engagement to be on base, we noticed the accuracy of the IDF improved. So where troop housing, business offices, things like that, start getting a little closer to home. The only conclusion we could come to, and our thinking was that there was insiders amongst us who were actually, after a rocket comes over, going back a little bit later, saying, okay, adjust it a little bit to the right or a little bit back, and you might hit somebody. So in the cyber realm, I think the similar type of concerns can happen. Who's amongst us and how trustworthy are they, and what can we do as cyber professionals to keep the insider at bay? So let's talk a little bit about the threat landscape that's out there, what Symantec's research findings are showing a fundamental shift. The old motivation was sort of to put little cartoon characters or say you're pawned or you're owned and that kind of thing, just to make some humorous thing and get some street creds in the hacker community that you were successful at impacting a federal site. Then, of course, the adversaries realized there's money to be made in data, and the advent of cybercrime, where even if you do like MBA business studies, things of that nature, you'll see segmented market sectors, things like that get analyzed. And we started to see this emerge in the cyberspace, where certain companies, and maybe in one part of the world, they would develop a certain type of payload, another focused on the social engineering aspect, and you could actually go and build your cyber attack platform and sort of modularize these components. But the whole idea was to get money out of the system. Then, of course, espionage is the one of the world's oldest professions, going back to the dawn of man. And by having so much of our federal information online, it didn't take long for foreign intelligence services to realize that there's good cyber espionage capabilities. We now live in the age, though, of cyber warfare. We've seen whenever there's kinetic engagements around the world between nation states, we're seeing it predicated by specific cyber attacks on command control, communications infrastructure, modification of websites, things to both embarrass the opposing forces' government, but also to disrupt military operations and things in the campaign. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a breach, how it occurs. So if you think of like an external APT element conducting an attack in a federal space, but you also could have perhaps insiders doing their thing, and perhaps even the two working in conjunction which would be quite alarming, because if a malicious payload was delivered, sort of looked like a spear phishing attempt, but in reality the insider's job simply is to click on something while they're logged in with elevated rights, you could see how that could quickly have some significant secondary and tertiary effects across your federal infrastructure. Of course, we all are vigilant in doing our FIPS 199 assessments of our federal systems, where we are looking at the confidentiality, integrity, and availability for low, moderate, and high data sets. So it's sort of like a cat and mouse game where we're trying to keep the adversary at bay, and we're focusing our cyber resources on the most sensitive and important data. So let's talk first about the first phase, which is the incursion. The whole point of incursion is to establish a beachhead within your federal architecture. This is done through reconnaissance, both technical reconnaissance and social engineering type reconnaissance. Even a conference like this, an adversary could potentially try to see who's attending, try to overhear some conversations, things of that nature, which is why we all have to practice good OPSEC everywhere we go. Things like zero-day vulnerabilities, and these types of incursions, they're rarely automated. The old days of what we call spray and pray, just mass mailing of malware is gone, because the sensor grid is smart enough to detect when something like that is in progress and basically shut it down in real time. So it's much more targeted, and again, social engineering is a big part of that. So here's just a fictitious example of what an email attachment could be. Something that's a package that's zipped, and maybe the defensive technologies don't drill down into a zipped file, and that could be a methodology for getting something into the environment. The phase of discovery. So the whole idea here is for the adversary, for the APT, is to conduct a network map and basically find the crown jewels within your federal organization. We all know there's tons and tons of federal data on every system, but what is the key thing? What would that APT be interested in identifying and locating? So things like software and hardware exploits, gathering system administrator credentials and passwords, things of that nature, even developing multiple access points, because if the cyber posture is hardened, that beachhead that occurred in the incursion phase could be swept away. So at this point on discovery, they're looking for multiple ways to have set up some future communications, things of that nature. Once the capture phase goes into effect, then the adversary is basically making their decision for, do we want to impact the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of this federal system, or some combination of those. The things we see in the news are almost always around the confidentiality. We hear that a massive data set of federal data has been exfiltrated. A foreign APT is accused of it, and it kind of plays out in the news media as well as within federal offices to figure out what the proper response should be. But I also, myself, I worry about the integrity and availability, because currently the U.S. government is, we're not facing a massive catastrophe like another Katrina or, gosh, in the movie theaters there's that Andreas Fault movie right now. But if you think about it, if the U.S. were to engage in a major war with a nation state, if we had a major catastrophe, some natural disaster, or even some combination, are there sleeper personnel and sleeper malware components that their job is to actually, in those events, compromise both the integrity and availability of the systems, not just try to do, impact the confidentiality. So this is when things like the stolen credentials are used. And the other thing is the adversary, once they're inside, their goal is to go low and slow, to remain undetected. If you think of like SOC SIM tools, they'll do the alerting from 1 through 10. So sometimes something might pop as a 7, but then if that device doesn't do anything, let's say for 6 weeks, pops another 7. But if it was going 7, 8, 7, 7, all within like a 5-minute time period, that in and of itself would ramp things up to, let's say, a 10. So the whole idea of going low and slow and remaining undetected. Of course, the last phase, and the last phase I would say on my deck, I actually have a phase beyond the last phase that I just want to talk about, but last phase is the whole idea of exfiltration, having the sensitive data sent back to the APT's command and control system, using some advanced encryption or some other side channel methodologies to do the exfil, to remain undetected, because their goal is that you don't even know when the data has left the organization. What I would say is phase 5 is sort of their version of continuous presence. So even if something occurs where the exfiltration occurs, let's say it's discovered, it's in the news media, if they've buried other things that It's sort of like that whack-a-mole game where you just can't seem to get the persistent threat out of the system. So let's talk a little bit about insiders specifically and how to conduct a proper data loss prevention strategy. The statistical information you see here is Semantics findings. It's Semantics, a global corporation, so I'm not reporting on federal specific. I think it's actually would be different types of, like for example, 50% of employees leaving with data. That's a corporate model. I don't believe that's the case with government. But the cost of breaches, the things about legal and compliance penalties, and each of your federal agencies perhaps processes credit card information, especially if you're doing things regarding citizen engagement. So things like PCI compliance. Most federal agencies have their own medical services division, so you have PHI, personal health information of the federal workforce, as well as citizens if they're getting some type of health care through government systems. And then, of course, the reputation of your organization. A federal agency, it's very difficult, I'm sure, I can imagine, for the senior leadership if their agency is in the news and there's some issue showing that there was a significant compromise. I don't think anyone enjoys, having to go testify up on the Hill as to, what went wrong and what should have been done better, that sort of thing. So we all recognize that, reputation is a factor. It's perhaps not the major factor, but it is part of the concern area. So here's just some basic definitions. We've already talked about the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When it comes to cybersecurity, many organizations really focus on the inbound defense, making sure malware is not coming in, but they may be lagging a little bit behind in what type of data is leaving the organization. And of course, for federal agencies to conduct their assigned missions and duties for the American public, there are times when data has to be moved external to the organization, whether it's coordinating with state and local governments, allied partners, local law enforcement, engagement with corporate entities, engagement with the citizenry. All these things involve data moving bidirectionally. So there does need to be good security controls for both the inbound as well as the outbound. So let's look at some of the history specific to the United States and some of our allied countries involving insider threats and some of the success that they've had. Of course, we all know about Benedict Arnold. What many don't know is when the American Revolution started, he was well respected. He was friends with George Washington, and he was conducting successful campaigns. At the Battle of Quebec, which was a very bloody battle, the Patriot cause did beat the British there. But to do so, Benedict Arnold, who was himself wealthy, he had to expense a lot of things. He had to buy his own supplies for his troops. He had to pay informants and spies and all these sorts of things. So when he submitted his expense report, it was a pretty high number, and a lot of Washington's senior leadership in the Continental Army questioned the ethics of Benedict Arnold. They felt maybe he padded the expense report. This got back to him, and this was what started him from being somebody aligned with the Patriot cause, a turn in his heart against our republic and our ideals, and siding with the enemy. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, of course, with the whole atomic bomb program, providing highly classified physics and scientific data to the Soviet Union, helping to foster their atomic and nuclear weapons program. Alger Hiss, of course, is still debated whether he was providing the Soviet Union with our inside diplomatic communications when the United Nations was being stood up. But in any event, it does appear through historical analysis that the Soviets had a real jump on negotiating what the final structure of the UN would look like at the conclusion of the war. Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, Anna Montez, also spies for the East Bloc. One of the interesting things about Robert Hansen, there were a lot of bells and whistles that went off with this guy before he was finally prosecuted. He downloaded a password cracking utility off the public internet and uploaded it to a top secret system. The system itself raised the flags, security team cornered him, and they said, "Hey, Hansen, what are you doing? Why are you downloading that and putting it on password cracker on the classified network, on a top secret network?" And he said, "Well, we have this color printer in the office, and it's run by this Windows platform, and no one can print to it. It has settings have to be reset. Nobody remembers the password. So I have this get or done mentality. I'm just going to upload this utility, reset the password, and then remove that utility." hey, IT department, I recognize that maybe I shouldn't have done that. I should have gotten your help. I did open a trouble ticket, though. It didn't get resolved after 4 or 5 days, and we needed some color printing. So that excuse was enough to sort of not raise the flag on him. But then there were other things where his coworkers complained that he shoulder surfed, that he would say some inappropriate things, some of his behavioral things. He also got in a lot of disciplinary trouble for something even more egregious than the password cracking tool. He actually went into the counterintelligence database and ran a query against himself. So he was trying to see if he was, in fact, under any type of investigation. When they cornered him on that, and they said, Hansen, what are you doing? Why are you running this query on yourself? He said, oh, well, since I'm doing CI-type work, I want to see how the tool works. And I don't want to do it on a coworker because that would be inappropriate. So I just ran the query on myself. And again, that didn't raise enough flags. And any of these could perhaps have been the trigger for him as an insider that could have caused more scrutiny, and the very extreme damage he did to our national security could have been mitigated. Anna Montez, of course, she actually did her work very well, very professionally. There's a photo of her posing with President Bush II, receiving some type of an executive level award for the work she was doing at DIA, and yet Anna Montez simultaneously was a colonel in the Cuban KGB. The other one I'd like to mention is John Surratt, probably a name you're not familiar with. Surratt was a colleague of John Wilkes Booth and actually helped plan the assassination of President Lincoln. The other thing about Surratt is he provided a lot of documentation during the war on Union troop movement to the Confederacy, causing loss of life. When the war ended, he actually framed his own mother, who actually did time. He made it look like it was her doing. He left the country and served as a mercenary in Egypt for a fringe group in Egypt. He came back to the U.S. later and actually wasn't prosecuted. Certain things the statute of limitations had run out on. The Cambridge Five, of course, they were of wealthy, noble families in the UK, working for their intelligence services, but they were ideologically predisposed to the Soviet Union, providing classified materials that caused a lot of our deep cover agents to lose their lives. Abdul Qadir Khan from Pakistan, he's actually, to my knowledge, he's still under house arrest in Peshawar, but he was a metallurgical engineer, a PhD, spoke pretty much all the major European languages. All of his career, he was in the civilian nuclear sector. Later in life, went back to Pakistan, started a company, but he was doing this in conjunction with the Pakistani military, was collecting from the industrial aspect of nuclear information, so technologies, actually procuring certain types of materials and things like that, all of this helping Pakistan to develop their own nuclear weapons program. So the key question I have after hearing, it's pretty depressing, right? How many people like this could currently be unknown because they remain in the shadows within both federal and industrial workspaces? So, of course, having a good cybersecurity program, a good insider threat mitigation program, a lot of times it just comes down to having proper O&M, operations and maintenance, of your federal systems. So I've listed out a lot of the NIST special pubs. They provide great guidance on just different things, to not maybe insider threat specific, but things that can help to properly have good, robust architectural framework and cybersecurity implemented. One of these special pubs, 800-144, talks about cloud computing. There's been a lot of executive level mandates to move more and more federal data into the cloud, reduces TCO, helps with green computing initiatives, and also modernizes, and with the large volumes of federal data, cloud does definitely make sense. But the concern is, just as this famous bank robber, Willie Sutton, was asked when he finally got captured, Willie, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. So according to this NIST special pub, they say, just as economies of scale exist in robbing banks instead of individuals, a high payoff ratio exists if one of our federal clouds were to be compromised. Of course, the granddaddy or grandmommy of hardening and securing our systems revolves around 853 Rev 4. One of the key takeaways there, of course, is Appendix J, which provides some additional impetus to PII and protecting federal workforce privacy data as well as our citizenry. And then I'd also like to talk about some of the things in the current administration, 2 of the executive orders, and as well as a change to the NISPOM. So The first is Executive Order 13526 for classified national security information, and then EO 13587, which provides structural reforms for improving security of classified systems. And that is the document that actually set up the Insider Threat Task Force that a lot of federal agencies are implementing. So let's talk about EO 13526. One of the things that came out of this was the establishment of the National Declassification Center. Part of that mission set, because there's such a large volume of classified data, is to take a good second look and say, well, what things can be declassified? What are the proper processes for doing so? Because if you try to defend everything, essentially you end up defending nothing, right? So if the total volume of classified material grows exponentially, that means the cost to keep that all hardened grows exponentially. So if certain things can be moved to a lower classification level, if they're no longer a threat to national security, then they can be put at a lower classification level, which then allows the resources to really stay focused like a laser on those things that really do need to remain highly secure. The whole idea of setting up the Insider Threat Program with EO 13587 establishes the Insider Threat Program across the federal government. So this is pretty interesting because it's sort of like, remember the Wendy's commercial with the Where's the Beef lady? So this is like, well, where's the beef for insider threat? In a post-Snowden operating environment for federal, what are the things that each agency should do? So this is the whole idea that specific federal executives will have oversight and management of these programs, that the federal workforce and the activities that they're doing will come under increased monitoring, but then hitting the right balance to make sure that the workforce's Fourth Amendment rights are not violated. So people a lot smarter than me, attorneys and some other folks are taking good hard looks at what's acceptable and not acceptable, and this provides that guidance for that to really implement that and make it successful. So let's talk a little bit about changes to the NISPOM, the conforming change number 2. Basically, it's saying that corporations that receive, create, or process, or handle, or decommission classified information have to map to the federal controls. In addition, they have to set up their own insider threat programs. So it basically runs in parallel with what the federal agencies are doing. And one of the interesting things, this is pending this conforming change number 2, but I think it'll be interesting how it will impact federal IT in that if there are federal agencies that work with certain, let's say, contractors, cleared contractors and such, if those corporations don't develop the insider threat program that meets the standards in this change, will those companies be prohibited from bidding or even participating in federal IT work? So I think a lot of people are looking at that, and I think that when this NISPOM change is released, that's going to have a large impact for that reason. So one of the things I'd like to just say about setting goals, I myself, I don't want to be presumptuous and stand here and tell, federal leadership and federal IT leadership what your goals should be. These are simply some of the suggestions that myself and Symantec have for, not just for federal, but for corporate as well, and some of the things we think are relevant to having a good insider threat program. So things like safeguarding the lives and safety and the reputation of your organization, protecting those crown jewels, the most important data, and then making sure that the embarrassing public disclosures don't occur. So how do we do this? So one of the goals should be to discover where the crown jewels of sensitive data resides and identify the types of endpoints that are at the highest risk. And one of the things I always like to say is a certain employee might be doing their mission properly. They might have a secure IT system, but because of the operational tempo, the nature of what that federal employee is doing, their mission set, that employee, as well as their device and devices and the data they touch, is at exceptional risk. If you think about like forward deployed elements or national security type operations, things like that, law enforcement, the chance of, let's say, a ruggedized tablet to get lost or stolen or to be left on a battlefield is there. So really trying to identify how far, like if you think your sensitive data is here, has it actually made it out to the endpoint, out to, let's say, a mobile device or a laptop? And then actively monitoring the ways that this data is used on these endpoints, and then be able to flag abnormal behavior. So that could be like a third goal. And then also, we want to make sure our federal workforce, they're under increasing constraints, increasing budget, increasing mission set. So make sure that whatever we're doing in the cybersphere is not negatively impacting their missions. So having good cybersecurity programs, good insider threat mitigation strategies, but do it in a way that's efficient and it's unobtrusive to that end user. So this is actually my second attempt at humor here. I have a DLP strategy in 10 easy steps. None of this is easy, so I say that kind of joking, 10 easy steps. But in reality, it's not, you shouldn't even necessarily consider it a project. It's a program. It's not a one and done type of thing. So it's almost like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you get through it, you start over at the beginning, and it's a never-ending process. I'm going to go through these individually so we don't have to read each one of these up here because I know it's a smaller font. So first step, identifying the appropriate data owners. Within the federal government, if you go on, let's say, a Microsoft server, and you look at the Kerberos ticketing and for specific data sets, and you look at the permissions and such, and you do a deep dive analysis, sometimes the system owner of specific data will say system. Sometimes it'll be an administrative, an admin, a sysadmin user account. Sometimes it's a service account. Sometimes it's an employee, a contractor or a federal employee, who no longer even works there, but they were the originator of that data set, so it's tagged that they're the owner. So one should not just look at the Windows permissions, so to speak, and say, that's the owner. It's actually who's accessing the data, who's using it, who benefits, who would be impacted if the confidentiality, integrity, availability of the data was modified. So using technical systems to identify those data users, and then to speak with them and prioritize, what they feel is the most critical data within their data sets. And then also the second one, locate all of the places where sensitive data resides. When we sit with federal customers and sort of do this analysis, a lot of times people are very surprised because they'll say, our sensitive data is on these certain file shares and this certain user community accesses it. But what happens is sometimes things get copied, right? Something could get copied and put in a chat that goes to somebody else. They copy paste it, upload it into Word, PDF it, embed it in something that becomes an image, a JPEG or what have you. There's a lot of ways that sensitive data can maybe stay within that accreditation boundary, so to speak, but nonetheless, it's swirling around in different locations that is not intuitive to, let's say, the ISM, the Information System Security Manager, or the ISO, the Information System Security Officer of that specific accredited enclave. So just some of the things to consider are network devices, storage, databases, file servers, if there's some type of a web portal or things being uploaded to, any kind of special applications, laptops, mobile devices, also email servers, and then do things reside, either on the MTA or proxy. PST files, users, once they start hitting constraints on their Outlook client, they may archive PST, they may rename it, resave it, all these sorts of things occur. And then just trying to find locations. Does it end up on a scanner? Does it get faxed? Did somebody make physical photocopies of it? Probably in federal, you're not using Dropbox or Evernote, but perhaps on unclassified systems, some users are finding ways to traverse through that. Any type of removable media, CDs, DVDs, USB drives. The other thing is free webmail services. On unclassed systems, some federal agencies block, like Hotmail, Gmail, et cetera. But then as part of the user rules of behavior, they allow de minimis personal use of the unclassified federal IT systems. So let's say you have a workforce that is doing graduate school in the evening or something like that. They may have a university.edu account that they're sending their professors emails and working collaboratively and such. So you may block all of the .com type free email, but there could be academic or .org or other volunteer organizations. So you really have to think, are there other email methods where we could have some movement or spillage of data that our sensor grid isn't even aware of? So just some things to think of. And also FTP puts. If somebody has an FTP client and there's, let's say, a large encrypted package that's sent out through FTP, is that something that's being closely monitored or not? And then that, maybe ask that user, what exactly is going on. Or maybe not ask the user, right? Maybe just start monitoring what that behavior, what's causing it. So once you've identified what is your sensitive data, where is it, who are the real deal data owners for it, that's all well and good, but it's still an academic exercise until you actually tag the sensitive data. So you have to develop some type of a technical system that will sort of tag where that sensitive data resides. And then to monitor and learn, how is that data typically used? How is it generated? Is it iterated? Are there by your workforce? Are there multiple instances of it? Like theoretically, if you had, let's say, a certain procedure for some type of a tactical mission set, let's say this became a best practice, was shared across multiple communities of interest that are doing something similar, but each one then modifies it, tailors it for their own operating environment. So one has to think, does that, have you actually had some type of a loss of sensitivity? And perhaps it hasn't. Maybe perhaps nothing improper, incorrect has occurred, but now you have multiple channels where something could conceivably go wrong and how the confidential integrity or availability of that sensitive data could be impacted. And then, again, understanding where it goes. There's a country western song, looking for love in all the wrong places. The concern, the bigger your back-end infrastructure, the more employees, the more geographically dispersed, the more platform dispersed. It used to be pretty much everyone had Windows operating system. Now you see a lot more Macs, you see tablets, so now you have Android operating systems, all various flavors of Linux. So all of these things are things to take under consideration. So where does the data go? What platforms does it reside on? So again, I guess my third attempt at humor, don't look for your data in all the wrong places. So developing automatic real-time methods to enforce your CISO or your ISM-approved data security policies. So it shows some of the steps here and how, when you implement them, how your risks are reduced over time. So the goal is to get to the prevention stage where as soon as some sensitive data starts to move in a way that violates your organizational policy, that it's immediately flagged and the remediation actions are taken against it. So, of course, doing this, I would just say, Rome was not built in a day. We do have the executive order to have an insider threat task force and these insider threat programs put in place. But a serious insider threat mitigation program is not, as I mentioned before, it's not a one and done. It's not if you think of the old school, FISM accreditation every 3 years, you'd have your system security plan and you'd look at the POAMs levied against the system and sort of check, and are there acceptable risk memos for open POAMs? Are there certain remediation steps that need to be taken or that are still part of the POAM? That's certainly important. That gives structure, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. But when you're dealing with this type of insider threat activity, it really does require CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation, to make sure that as that sensitive data, when it's put in, there's data at rest, data in use, data in motion, data in storage. So when you think about it, when that data goes in use, is it being used in a way that's not consistent with organizational policies and directives, and identifying that? So the first step with visibility is to understand where your data is stored, how it's being used across your enterprise. Without that knowledge, it's going to be very hard to identify what right looks like. Remediation, once you've identified any type of, let's say there's broken business processes. Let's say users go to the file share where the data is supposed to be stored, or go to a portal, and let's say they're simply copying it or screenshotting it and then working on it in a different manner. It doesn't necessarily mean the user is nefarious. It simply means the user needs some additional training and corrective measures. It could mean they're nefarious, though. So you just kind of have to do these types of assessments as you go. But the whole idea of cleaning up the misplaced data, multiple storage areas, and then remember I mentioned those high-risk users that are in a fast operational tempo. Maybe they're federal executives that have some very sensitive information coming at them. Even on an unclassed system, I would argue, in aggregate, SBU, FOUO, especially if it has calendar entries of senior policymakers and officials, that in and of itself would be of interest to an APT or an insider threat. So something to consider there as well. The whole idea of notification. To stop users from accidentally or maliciously leaking information, So some of your options are quarantine the activity. So if the data goes to the wrong place, block it and quarantine that data set. You could allow the move to occur, but then encrypt it and send some alerts to show that sensitive data was moved, but it was encrypted in the process. And the other idea is, perhaps giving the user some pop-up warnings, things like that, that they have to agree. They have to recognize that this is, it could say perhaps violates policy. Do you want to proceed? Please note, security office will be notified if you click yes. But if they have a mission set that calls for this, and if they have additional context, so that they know they're not violating the policy, they know this is acceptable, it allows them on a Wednesday at 2 a.m., perhaps when the proper decision maker is not around on the cyber side, to say okay, and then that could be reviewed in the morning. So again, I'm not presumptuous to tell you how to do your program, just trying to stimulate some thought here, some ideas that Symantec has, both for federal and for corporate entities. So I'd like to talk a little bit about system administrators. Some of that's unfortunately been cause for a lot of problems in the federal space. I think for the most part, system administrators are versed in what the proper security procedures are, but it's certainly advisable to spend additional time to sit down with them and go over the policies to make sure that they know that okay, system administrator, you've been given elevated rights, but with great privileges and rights comes additional great responsibility. And the other thing is they might be more receptive than you might initially think, especially in the area of de-escalating sysadmin privileges. Prior to working for Symantec, I myself worked for different defense contractors and system integrators within different federal office spaces. And one of the things I found was, and I felt uncomfortable with this, was very quickly when people saw that I was competent behind the KVM and setting things up, I started to accumulate admin privileges across the infrastructure. So I might have domain admin, I might have certain login on the switch fabric, I might have certain capabilities in the virtual infrastructure. And I remember going to management saying, I was tasked with doing project X, Y, and Z, that's finished. I would like my rights actually removed. But I don't think most system administrators think like that. They just simply come to work. Most are good, patriotic Americans. They're not going to try to do anything nefarious. But if their accounts, if their credentials are compromised, then remember we talked about the steps for the anatomy of a breach. Those credentials could be used by the APT to escalate and do a lot of damage to the federal system. And yes, that system administrator would be called into question, but they could say, hey, you know what, I was in the hospital, I was on vacation or what have you, I wasn't even in the building, there's no way I could have logged into this sensitive system that has no external access, so clearly my username and password got compromised. So again, having sort of the discrete channels. Now, I recognize with what I'm saying comes additional cost to the federal agency, and we're all under budget constraints, because if you have a talented IT worker and you have basically what I'm talking about, separation of duties, and also rotating people and making sure that some people do go off shift for mandatory vacation blocks, things like that, and then have someone else fill in, because a lot of times things can get exposed when a second set of eyes takes a look. But yet I recognize that increases the overall labor cost. But again, separation of duties, I think we all recognize that is a cybersecurity best practice, and it definitely can help mitigate against insider threat. So the best IR program is for the incident never to have happened in the first place. Again, if data is in motion, if it's not in the motion that it's supposed to go in, to have those various steps kick in. The corporation Lockheed Martin has what they refer to as the cyber kill chain model. You'll see within Department of Defense, DISA actually, I think on their website they've referenced that Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain model. But the whole idea that there's various stages, and if incident response can simply stop it from happening, then you don't need to have all this additional remediation, and the national security impact did not occur. So the other thing is to review specific file permissions. A user or a group of users may have a certain mission that requires them to have access to certain data, but if they're moved off that mission, it's actually probably infrequent that people, unless it's at a TS level, typically people aren't read off those types of activities. But I would argue even in an unclassified environment or a secret environment, it's nonetheless very important to only give people access to what they're supposed to and constantly have management reviewing those things. The other thing is, recommendation is to have additional encryption as part of your defense in-depth posture. Again, data loss prevention is a multi-step process. Detecting incidents is only actually the first step. The hard work is where I would say is what's called the incident in motion. So what happens when it's detected? If it can be stopped dead in its tracks, the damage in the post-incident cleanup can be minimized. The way to reduce the amount of time and resources it takes to respond to an incident is through response automation. Especially we live in an interconnected world 24/7, 365. During inclement weather, things like that, you might not have the appropriate cybersecurity resources on-prem doing the mission. So the more that can be automated, certainly the better. There are probably federal IT workers, even in the audience here, that work with a lot of different security applications every day. So I would say to you, how enjoyable your overall DLP program will be for you to work with is going to drive a lot of your personal job satisfaction. So it is a serious consideration for what tools and what things to implement. But keep in mind, the best and most practical approach is always automation first, people second. And there are times when you actually have to have people actually look at it, call the user, go over to their desk, find out what's going on, if it appears to be an incident. But again, the more that can be automated, the better. So with an effective DLP program, if you can customize your response rules to match your business processes, that way you could remediate what Symantec statistically categorizes as between 60 and 70% of all incidents could be automatically remediated. And this is things like to relocate the data, prevent it from leaving, and providing the right notification. Specific to the automation, there's a workflow that occurs, right? So enforcing that the majority of incidents based on response defined in policies. So let's say as just an example, let's say certain communications should not be allowed to leave the agency. Others could be encrypted. Others could be relocated. Some could be prevented from going, let's say, to laptops or mobile devices. And then notification. Making sure that, and the other thing I would say around notification is you don't necessarily want it to go to a username, like either a text alert to them or an email marked urgent or such, but actually have it go to a shared inbox. So if that key, cyber incident responder they're not in the office that day, or they're, even if they're on some type of a recall system, they could be asleep, they could be swimming laps or something where, here you have this major national security event in process and you can't get to the right person. So, having those types of shared duties and shared alerting systems. And then routing it to the right responders that have the right technical means and analytic capabilities to actually get to the root cause of what's going on. So the goal is to drive accountability for handling an incident to the proper personnel. The other thing is, think about like if there was a major attack against U.S. systems that was happening at a very fast clip, there would be a need to conduct triage and actually focus on the priority incidents first. And of course, that would be a very bad day for everybody, but I think having some wargaming exercises where, if you think of like a black swan event, if some really cataclysmic things were happening in the U.S., and if that was the opportunity for insiders to start, really impacting the CIA triad, then what would be the key areas, things that, perhaps certain subnets get knocked offline deliberately to protect certain, the crown jewels, so to speak. So also having the right information provided, I think at senior government levels, you get these like executive dashboard reports. And I've been in those meetings where like certain report metrics are shown. And I often wonder, is the data accurate, or are there parts of that IT infrastructure that are not perhaps getting collected on? So the metrics could have some, the fidelity of them could be in question. And the other thing is, are we asking the right questions? Are we providing the leadership with the right metrics, the right framework? So the microcosm of that is, as you develop an insider threat program, or as you mature your insider threat programs, what would be those right questions? What would be those right technical metrics? What are those things that for executive level briefing would be the right things, and things that if you see patterns over time could provide for additional scrutiny? Again, I can't tell you for your specific agency what those things would be, but at least try to stimulate some food for thought, so to speak. The other thing is the need for speed, right? As I mentioned at my opening, cyber moves at the speed of light. So Symantec has what we call the 5-second test. Can an incident responder respond to an incident in 5 seconds or less based on the information they're presented with? So again, the more automation, the better, but if it does go to a responder, is the format that they ingest it logical, or do they have to do a lot of digging and doing Google searches on phrases and things that are really just going to delay the process? Because at that point, you're not doing incident response, you're doing post-event, post-spill cleanup operations. Productive actions coupled with the right actions are the two key steps, I would say, for the DLP workflow. And anytime you can have a one-click response where perhaps that security team has binary choices, block, don't block, close off a subnet, don't close it, take down a website, don't take it down, freeze activity on a certain database or what have you. If it can be made binary, that's even better because it kind of reduces the complexity while the cyber engagement is occurring. And again, if there are incidents that are reported up to leadership, the other takeaway I would think is when an event occurs, an insider threat event occurs, think in advance as part of your wargaming process, what would be the appropriate follow-on analytics, metrics, follow-up? So if you plan that out in advance, then you have so the event itself would be day 0, but you could do like a D+1, D+2. So let's say every 24 hours post-event, what does right look like as far as mitigation and reporting? Because what happens is the leadership will kind of swarm on that incident response team and say, okay, I need to know these like 832 things, and a lot of people in conference room, a lot of buzz going on. The more you have pre-staged your ability to meet those requirements, the better you'll be able to rise to the occasion when that type of event occurs. So let's just talk about some of the folks that could be involved with insider threat. As I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, not all the insiders are malicious. Actually, most probably aren't. And some are inside, and some, of course, could be APT actors working collaboratively that are outside. So let's give a few fictional use cases. Let's start with Betty. She means well. She's a loyal American. She's working on a spreadsheet, and you know how spreadsheets have the workbook has worksheets at the bottom. So she doesn't believe there's any PII in it, but on one of the tab she's working on does not, but some of the other ones do. So she tries to email it. An appropriate response could be, so the response could be that your DLP program's content inspection could flag it as soon as she hits send. And some of your organizational options you could set would be to simply monitor it and report it to security, but let it happen. You could notify the user with a pop-up saying, Betty, are you sure you're doing this? There's PII in your spreadsheet. You could let it leave the organization, but in an encrypted format, or simply block it. So the result, if the DLP program is properly implemented, in this case, Betty would learn what the risk was, and it would give a few options for the organization to manage that. Here's another one. Here's a new hire in the federal space working in finance. Sanjay had a successful career in corporate America doing accounting. Now he's taken on the role of being a federal worker. And he has some practices and procedures from his old job where he was saving things to removable media, doing some work at home. And he's got a real robust can-do attitude for his mission with the government. But he's not quite trained up. So he actually makes this mistake. And then if you have a good data loss prevention program in place, the actual endpoint device itself. So when he puts in the removable media and when sensitive data starts to move to it, you could set to automatically flag it, provide Sanjay with the appropriate training on the fly, or do things to change the behavior. Here is a special agent that's working, let's say, between federal and state and local government. Normally, he's very well versed on proper cyber policies in his organization. Charles does not, he's been doing this for years. He doesn't violate processes. But his mission, remember I talked about those specific users that they're high risk just because of the nature of their work. So Charles is an example of this. He's been actually physically awake, running around doing his mission for over 24 hours. The organizational SOP is when he goes off shift, he has to save certain things. Out of sheer exhaustion, Charles makes a mistake. And then he goes off shift and catches gets 4 hours of sleep so he can come back and do it again. So in this instance, you could allow it to notify him or simply allow it to go but encrypt it. You could actually leave a stub there and move it to another location where that type of sensitivity of that data could be stored, and then implement all the rights management policy. So this way the crown jewels don't have that sort of within your accreditation boundary, that leakage into other parts of the system. So today would be no fun with me up here if I didn't actually talk about a real deal spy. So Mimi is that malicious spy. She actually works, remember I talked about the changes to the NISPOM. So Mimi's actually working for a large defense contractor. She has a PhD in chemical engineering. She's working on some very classified programs, and she's also been compromised. She's now on the payroll of a hostile foreign intelligence service, and her goal is to take the sensitive data, and then perhaps it's even highly classified, and remove it and provide it to that country. So an effective data loss prevention program at your agency would put tools in place that would monitor this, would flag it. Again, that NISPOM model down even at that corporate level, having a parallel program in place there to make sure that she's caught. So some options would be to notify her, simultaneously let security team and HR know, stop it in place, lock out her account, et cetera. And then the human action would be perhaps to contact law enforcement within the building or FBI or what have you, because you're dealing with espionage. And the whole idea is, the other thing is a psychological effect, right? If an organization doesn't have a mature insider threat program or mature cybersecurity policies, and users sense that, if they are approached and they're going to get compromised, they might be more reluctant to do it if they thought the chances were high that they would actually get caught, get prosecuted, and go to jail. So I would like to think that for the majority of the federal workforce and the majority of contractors, they will not mishandle classified or sensitive government data because they're proud to be Americans. They want to do the right thing for our country, right? But for those that get a little, like Benedict Arnold, those that get a little wobbly with that, it would be highly beneficial if they also were just flat out scared. They said, you know what? The cyber team here is awesome. This is a well-managed federal IT system. It's highly secure. The operations and maintenance is just perfectly run. Okay, I'd like to be a spy. I'm not going to because I'm scared of the consequences. I know that I'll get caught. So that could actually probably stop a lot of insider threats from participating in nefarious activities. So she's doing hard time now. So let's talk about the profiles of an insider. In the past, money was a large factor. Foreign governments actually paying people to do that. And I would say that logically would probably still be the case now as well as in the future. So bribery is as old as the human condition. The other thing is romantic allure. If we look at historical cases, people, especially if they're, let's say, working, doing government operations abroad or different things like that, if they get lured into some romantic intrigue, and that becomes the sort of way that they're compromised and encouraged to provide sensitive data to a foreign government. The other one is that's always looked at as major life events. If somebody is just going through a terrible situation in their personal life, life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We all have our various ups and downs. So the whole idea that, is somebody more likely to be compromised because of some of the external factors, things not specifically related to their work. One of the key things we see in U.S. history is if they feel belittled by their supervisors. Perfect case, Benedict Arnold. Hansen was kind of another one. When he was captured, his ego was a big part of it. He felt that the people he reported to were beneath his dignity to be supervised by them, and so for him it became this big game. Like, I'm managing the Soviets, I'm managing the Americans. I mean, guy really full of himself, massive ego. So these are kind of psychological. I'm not a psychologist, but just from doing my reading, this is sort of some of the themes and patterns we see. And then, of course, there's a new model where I think Snowden fits into this, and some of the WikiLeaks things, where certain people have access to sensitive government data, and they feel very justified. They're like, well, you know, I don't like the U.S. policy, or I don't agree with the foreign policy or the direction where country's going in, so I'm going to take matters in my own hands, and I'm going to provide this to this adversary because I actually have some compassion for their position. So that kind of thing can be easy to flag, because a lot of times those workers, their coworkers sense it. They'll go to lunch with them, and they'll hear that person saying anti-American things. So again, part of the Insider Threat Program is training the federal workforce that if you hear somebody talking like that, to actually report it so that that person can come under additional scrutiny. So I'd like to thank you for your time. I have a URL up here if you're interested in some of our in-depth data loss prevention technologies. At this time, I'd like to have a few minutes left to open up to any questions that anyone might have. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, sir. The onion routing applications, what is that?
So when I'm at home and I'm doing normal computing and I want to hit another website or I want to send something, there's normal protocols and procedures that occur on the internet for that to happen. Onion routing is a form of anonymization so that the IP address that my computer starts with is anonymized, and there's specific servers that then forward my request, anonymize it again and again. So if you think about an onion, there's layers that you peel off. The whole thing is that if, let's say, advanced government cyber analytics teams tries to look at, well, where did this data go? How did it get from this guy who lives in, let's say, Laurel, Maryland? He went to China, he placed some data there, he got some instructions back, but trying to actually find the physical location or the login account is anonymized in multiple layers, and because it's all done in software, it can be exponential. It could be, literally hundreds of layers to get through. So it basically makes our law enforcement job a lot harder. So you see onion routing in things like espionage, both corporate espionage, like stealing industrial secrets. You see it in nation-state espionage. And what's really utterly disgusting and tragic, you see this type of technology used for things related to, let's say, child pornography or exploitation of people, things of that nature. So does that answer your question? That's right.
And that's pretty much what I thought it did. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And I will say something positive about onion routing, because the technology, it's just like fire, can be good or bad, right? Fire is a tool, and fire can burn your house down. So if you think about some nations that have oppressive governments and places that are hostile to the U.S. interests, sometimes people are deep in those countries trying to get the message out for freedom and human rights. Sometimes they're using onion routing and other similar methods to have communications external to their country. So I think I have time for one more question, if anyone has any.
Thank you. You drew a pretty good picture of making the insider threat not as challenging as we all heard. Yet earlier, the FBI said it's hard to near impossible. I guess the truth is somewhere in the middle there, but I'm just wondering if you care to comment on the FBI's position.
I have prodigious respect for the FBI. I'm not going to try to counter anything they said. I actually hope my presentation did not come across that I think it's easy to catch insiders. I think it's critical that as a nation that we, take both the letter of the executive order as well as the spirit of it and really have these robust insider threat programs, deploy these technologies, also the human factor, the training of the workforce, the sort of the oversight, all these sorts of things, keeping that balance with our Fourth Amendment rights. But I'm not trying to say it's easy, but nonetheless we have to do it. So we have to give it our best effort, but we have a large nation, we have a large federal workforce, We have large number of industrial partners and such. So trying to weed out each and every, I mean, I had one slide where I said the key question, how many insiders are there still within our architecture that have account access? I would never be assumptive and say, I know for a fact that this specific agency or this organization is free of insiders. Even like Benedict Arnold, one time he was loyal American, loyal to the Patriot cause, and then he became a turncoat. So even if you have a workforce that is solid, right, their background checks, their polygraph, people can go bad. So it's a never-ending effort. It's like I said, painting the Golden Gate Bridge, or and it's not. And also, if you recall, I said it's not a one and done. So like, if I have a cavity and I get it fixed, that's a one and done. But brushing and flossing is vigilant. I have to do it, 2 or 3 times a day if I want to have the best oral hygiene. So again, I think insider threat is that model where it's not a project, it's a program. And I believe I'm now over time, so I turn it over to Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you.